Tonight on Free Minds TV, we talk about a positive ruling coming out of the U.S. Supreme Court, Amish men again being jailed for horse and buggy violations, a do-it-yourself space program being launched by pirates to keep the internet alive and well, plus more coming up tonight on Free Minds TV.
We challenge you, the viewer, to think outside the box. With you, as always, is Toby.
And Nick.
I say welcome back because we've been off for a week. We did not have a new show last week, which is a rare occurrence. We usually have a brand new episode or a special every single week, but things were out of our control. There was a very cold day last week here in New Hampshire, Keene, New Hampshire, where we're broadcasting from, and the station, Cheshire TV, the heat went out, and so it would
have been unpleasant to do a show.
Yeah, they were shut down for the day, so it was out of our control, so we couldn't do it. So we do apologize for that, but we are back with plenty of new content to get into. We're going to be getting into a possible new internet that some pirates out there, modern-day pirates.
People have been talking about this with SOPA and everything like that out there. They're talking about, whether it's explicitly, it's not all of these schemes are talking about explicitly for piracy, but they're talking about them just to keep an unregulated internet out there that's beyond the reach of government and other major institutions.
Yes. But first we have some other stories we want to talk about. The good news coming up out of the U.S. Supreme Court, which we don't get to talk about too often.
Unfortunately.
But before we get into the good news, let's focus on something that's a little bit more disturbing, having to do with that permanent record that students have.
Yeah, well, it's a digital age, Toby, and schools have long kept records on students while they're in school, but in the past it was done largely with paper records just because of the state of technology at the time. But now we're living in a digital age where a lot of this information is being put into databases. And thanks to No Child Left Behind, a piece of legislation with which most of us are familiar now, placed all kinds of mandates on the states in terms of what they need to provide in terms of education, all kinds of different regulations that they have to comply with, and it's something that many educators don't agree with. I certainly don't agree with it, and a lot of teachers feel the same way. But since the passage of No Child Left Behind, states have been required to increase the amount of data they collect about individual students, teachers, and schools. Personal information, including test scores, economic status, grades, and even disciplinary problems, and student pregnancies, are tracked and stored in a digital permanent record. Now, all of this information is being stored, it's being collected, and in most states, they mentioned that all 50 states and DC do collect this information. 40 states allow principals to access the data, and 28 of the states provides that individualized student level info to teachers, but they don't allow parents to access it, Toby. And this is, just one of those quirky things. Another piece of legislation, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, or FERPA, the way it was put in place didn't allow parents to have access to this information. Now it's been revised to give them more control over records, but still, I think the question remains, Toby, whether all of this information is necessarily relevant, and why did it take so long for parents to be allowed to access the information? You would think that if you want parents to be involved in the educational process, and that's one of the major things that contributes to academic success, is involved parents who are making sure their kids are staying on track and staying involved. Why would you want to collect all of this information and not allow parents to look at any of it? Seems a little odd to me, and it seems like the wrong kind of approach to gather all of this information and then not share it with parents.
I think there's different kinds of information as well. I know that there's most schools who collect electronic information do offer that a lot of that information to parents, such as grades and tests and schedules and all that stuff. I'm not too familiar with exactly the different laws in different states. So far, it's been left up to the different states of what they do with this. What makes me uneasy about just having these digital records out there, though, is what else they could possibly be used to. Every time I think of government having access to information, it makes me harken back to my paranoid side of 1984, and using the information for nefarious purposes. So maybe that's just my paranoid side. It just
yeah. Well, I don't know that it's necessarily paranoid. I mean, if you look at most human rights violations that have taken place over the last 100 years, the more information that governments collect on citizens, the better position they are. If people with nefarious designs get into power, the better position they are to be able to do bad things to you. And to have a record like we have now that's not just about grades and how many detentions you had, but really includes a wide range of information, including things like mental health issues, physical illnesses, jail sentences, pregnancy data, and it's sort of open-ended as to what they want to put in here, Toby.
Sure, and as states like Alabama are passing these immigration reforms that are really, they're not too friendly with immigrants, especially ones who are in the country illegally. Who accesses that information, because schools are now collecting that data and putting that in the permanent records as well, and who has access to that? It puts that funny feeling in my stomach that just doesn't make me feel all warm and tingly, Nick.
No, the idea I don't know. It sort of normalizes the idea that you have a file from the time you're young. And like I said, it's open-ended. So the question is, how hard would it be for them to group information in here like religious preference, political affiliations, et cetera,
Sure, and I'm not trying to say that it's not important to have a file that tracks kids, because it is used for educational purposes to give kids the best education in many, many circumstances. I do like the idea of the paper copy and only having relevant information in there.
Well, and it makes sense to allow parents to have access to the information,
Sure.
because these kids are still minors.
Right.
And if the government, and these are public schools we're talking about, if the government is compiling individual information on you, typically as an adult you would have some right to access under things like FOIA and right to know laws at the state level. But parents are essentially, in a legal sense, acting as representatives for their kids until they reach the age of majority. Why they would ever have, it's not like they can claim national security concerns here. So why they would ever allow a parent or guardian or a custodian not to have access to a dependent's records, I can't understand that.
Strange. I didn't know that. I thought they did.
Now they have made some modifications to FERPA so that they can, but now actually that modification that allows parents access now, it also expanded some of the things that they can put into the file. So they're compiling more information, but now parents can access it. So it's kind of a mixed bag in terms of whether that's good news or bad.
Sure. In my opinion, as someone who does work in the education field, I do feel like it is important to have this information, but it should only be information to help the student's education. That's the only pertinent information to be putting in there. If it's going to help the student in their academics, career, and social lives as they go through school, other stuff that's not there to help the child doesn't need to be there. But that's just my opinion, yes, and I'm not in the government, so I don't make the rules. All right, let's focus on something that's does make me feel those warm, tingly feelings. Well, not too much. It's a little bit of good news, not nearly as much good news as I'd like to say, because it's just a step forward. It's not like the leap I was hoping for. This coming from the Washington Post, where the Supreme Court has ruled that warrants are now needed in GPS tracking. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously, hey, that's nice, Monday, that police must obtain a search warrant before using a GPS device to track criminal suspects. But the justices left for another day the larger question about how technology has altered a person's expectation of privacy. That's a topic we've talked in depth about here on Free Minds TV. Justice Scalia wrote that the government needed a valid warrant before attaching a GPS device to a Jeep used by DC drug kingpin Mr. Jones, who was convicted in part because police tracked his movements on public roads for 28 days. Quote, we hold that the government's installation of a GPS device on a target's vehicle and its use of that device to monitor the vehicle's movements constitutes a, quote, search under the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, Scalia wrote, which is amazing because the Fourth Amendment is practically non-existent, it seems. It's been eviscerated for many, many years, in large part due to the war on drugs. So I'm actually kind of surprised that they went back on this. How far they went back on this, well, we don't know yet. Escalade notes here, this ruling only rules for the GPS device that was put on Mr. Jones's Jeep on his private property. If they had put it on public roadway and hadn't trespassed on his private property to put the GPS on, well, they're not ruling on whether that would have been an unconstitutional thing for the police to do in that situation. So they're only ruling that it was unconstitutional, I guess, according to this article, because they went on his private property to attach the GPS, which then secretly followed him around. Had they done it on a public roadway, would that have been legal? Well, I don't know. I guess that's going to be another court case.
It's going to take another ruling to say that. No, unfortunately, I don't think you can say with any certainty that they will rule that that would require a warrant. But to me, the idea that the police would place a physical device on your vehicle, whether it's parked in public parking or on private property, the idea that they would place a device on your property, the car is your property, it's not a public car, even if it's parked in public parking, the idea that they would place that there and then leave it transmitting as you drove around without your consent. I mean, many states, if a private individual did this to some other citizen's car, placed a GPS tracking device on it without their consent, that would fall under stalking legislation, that would fall under a number of things. So I think it's pretty clearly a trespass. To me, the idea that anybody, whether they're a police officer or not, would be able to place a tracking device on my vehicle without my consent and then monitor wherever I go, to me that's very clearly a trespass and should be illegal, whether they're police officers or not. And since that's the case, the police should need, in my opinion, should need a warrant in order to do that, because it's a trespass, and they should have a court order based on presenting evidence, presenting something that meets a burden of proof to get a warrant to place that on your car. Otherwise, they could just track all of us all the time with no suspicion whatsoever. And we're not that far from that point.
No, and well, what about if they did it on a public roadway, Nick? Because what this does is they
That's
do
what I'm
it.
saying.
Okay, so you're saying they don't need to, because the
I don't
trespass
care
here
about
is they
park-
physically trespassed and went
Right.
on his personal property, went into his driveway to attach the device. That's what they're
I
ruling
don't care if
about
you're parked
here.
on the side of the street. I don't care if
So
you're
you're
parked
gonna
in the
call it a
parking lot. I don't
trespass.
care if you're parked in the police department's parking lot.
So you're
They
calling
can tow
it.
you as far as I'm concerned if you got a parking violation, but no, none of that.
But you're calling it a trespass because it's their vehicle?
If
I'm just trying to make sure, because your version of
you were
trespass
parked
is
on a-
different from theirs.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Okay.
I'm saying I don't care whether the vehicle is parked on private property or not. I mean, if you were parked on a public roadway, or the people watching were parked on a public roadway, and I decided to sneak up to their vehicle, put a magnetic little tracking device on there, and then watch everywhere you went for the next 30, 60, 90 days, I think most people would consider that a violation. I didn't ask permission to put a tracking device on your vehicle.
But you're not the government.
No.
So
I'm not the government, but the rules as far as what constitutes a trespass should be the same.
Oh.
Because a police officer acting in the absence, when a police officer kicks in a door or serves a search warrant, I mean, they are committing a trespass. What would to anybody else normally be considered a trespass? They don't need permission to go on. They need a court order in order to make that kosher. But they're still coming on your property without your permission. And to my mind, there's not any difference really between them walking in the front door of your house and placing a tracking device on your car. To my mind, both of those, the assumption is that a reasonable person, would expect to have privacy and they should be asked to grant consent. To do either of those things without the person's consent would be trespassing, unless you had a court order that said you could do it.
So what if they tracked them by satellite? Because they can do that now. They could just have one of their satellites track
see,
a
and
person from space.
That's one of those tricky things. I mean,
It would be much more costly for
right,
them, but they
you
could
get
do
right
it.
into one of those gray areas. They can follow you around, and I don't think there's ever been, I don't think there's ever been a legal tradition where they say, the police can't watch you if you're in public. But it's one of those tricky things. To me, the idea that a device that's making a record of everywhere you go and uploading that information, and people aren't actually following you around, they put a thing on your car. If they want to follow me around in their car, that's fine. I can drive around and look at people driving, right? As a private citizen, I can do that.
Can you just follow someone
Cops can
around
do
for
that.
28 days? 60
See,
days,
then
90
you're
days
into that
without?
stalking thing.
Right.
And I think there is some case law that says they can't
How long are you allowed to just follow someone around for?
You run into one of those tricky areas, but to me, it's clear that while there are some gray areas there where I could see the court ruling one way or another and it being reasonable based on the case law and based on the Constitution, I can't see saying that the police have a right to place a tracking device on your car without your consent. I can't see any way that equates, don't put crap on my car, whether you're a cop or somebody else. I don't see how that is constitutional, and I don't see how that doesn't constitute an invasion of privacy and a trespass.
Well, because the Fourth Amendment's been completely eviscerated, but it got a little bit stronger today, that much stronger. We'll see. I guess it won't be all that long before we're talking about the next case, because of course police are going to try it the other way, and it's going to take someone taking it all the way to throughout the system, throughout the court system, back up to the Supreme Court. We'll be talking about this again because this is only because they went on his private property. We'll see what happens when the police decide to just put the tracking devices on when he's parked outside the bank or something, or someone is parked outside there. So this isn't the end of this issue, but at least some good news to be talking about instead of all the typical doom and gloom. I just don't want to hype it up like it's that big of a victory, because it's really isn't. It's fairly small. It does get rid of some of this whole idea of, well, you can go onto someone's driveway. The whole idea was you could go onto the driveway and place the tracking device as long as there's no fence that you're crossing, was the breach, where as long as it's just the driveway and you're not having to hop a fence, it's okay. Which is it's targeting people who are of a poorer class, because it's the rich people who live in a gated community or have a gated driveway that would be able to not be tracked. So some good news there, but could be better. We'll see.
We'll see.
All right, let's talk about a story we've talked about for years. The Amish and their buggies. And they don't like those
this
triangles.
This story looked very familiar, but this is actually a different new one. We've covered this 5 or 6 times probably.
It keeps on continuing. This Amish, they stick to their principles.
Yes, they do.
To say the least.
They have a very particular way of living their lives. It's grounded in their religious beliefs, and I don't agree with their religious beliefs. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be doing a show like this with all this technology. But I don't have anything against the Amish. For the most part, it seems like they want to live their lives peacefully and in accordance with their religion. They really don't have a reputation for bothering people. The Amish have a reputation for being very peaceful. I mean, I think they probably say they're going to be quiet neighbors. But this story is coming from Kentucky, where a group of Amish men were sent to jail on Thursday for refusing to pay fines for breaking state highway laws that require their horse-drawn buggies to be marked with orange reflective triangles. The men have a religious objection to the bright orange signs, which they say are flashy and conflict with their pledge to live low-key and religious lives. Anias Byler, the first of 10 Amish men due in Graves County District Court on Thursday, was sentenced to 10 days in jail. The men were jailed and found in contempt of court for refusing to pay jail fines, and they say they have no intention of paying.
So this
the judge is saying, right? The judge is saying, well, I actually understand your objection, but it's not up to me to, to waive the law. So you're going to jail.
My hands are tied. I'm just a lowly judge.
So what we're talking about here are those, the reflective triangles that you see on the back of farm equipment, slow-moving vehicles. They're supposed to put them on the back of their buggies. They don't.
Because they're too flashy.
Well, they do point out these people are members of the Schwarzentrooper sect, which is it's a more conservative off-branch of the Amish, and these are
the Amish of the Amish.
Right. These are many people think of the Amish as they don't use electricity. They won't drive, etc., etc. There's a lot of different groups, all the way from Mennonites down to these Schwarzentrooper Amish. And these guys don't use electricity. They don't use plumbing. I mean, they are living like you would live 150, 200 years ago.
Good for
They're
them.
not using any of the modern conveniences. So if they're willing to forego plumbing and they're willing to forego electricity because of their religious beliefs, they really have to put the orange triangles on?
Yeah.
I mean, they're not going to, because they just fundamentally
these
have
jail
disagreement
sentences aren't going to fix them. We've been repeating the same exact story, not the same exact one, but the same type of story, different states.
And it's usually a whole group of them. I don't know if they arrest them all, they decide to do a crackdown all at once, but yeah, they've gone after the Amish, not only on this, but on some other things. I think raw milk distribution, because there are a lot of Amish in Pennsylvania, obviously, but there's some in Ohio and Kentucky, etc. And sometimes they cross state lines with raw milk, and then that's, not only an issue where the state would take issue with it, but they've been raided by the feds and things like that. Really just for living simply, not hurting anybody else, basically just living as part of an agrarian society like people would have lived a couple hundred years ago, Toby. But the regulatory system is now so stringent that to do that is essentially illegal. And to be honest, especially when you're talking about conservative Amish, they're probably running afoul of a lot of laws. I think typically the government does turn a blind eye to some of the things they do more so than others in terms of licensure and things like that, health and safety
Building
regulations.
codes.
Right. Because if I wanted to use an outhouse in the state of New Hampshire, it was several years ago that they did it, but I can't choose to use an outhouse for plumbing anymore.
Unless it was grandfathered in.
Right, but
You
I can't dig a new two-holer.
No.
And certainly.
What about a one-holer?
Right. If I wanted to build a house that didn't use electricity,
I
say if you're going to do it, go big.
Double-decker?
I say a two-hole is the way to go. Your buddy might need to use it at the same time. But no, I mean, if I
There's
wanted
still
to,
one on my parents'
yeah,
farm
I mean,
with two-holer.
but if you building codes, all of this stuff. Hey, some of them were grandfathered.
It is grandfathered in.
I'm not pointing fingers.
I grew up without.
It's a very
plumbing for
difficult
while.
thing to prove too. I mean, I feel like if I dug a hole and said it had been there as a
You gotta
bathroom,
go way down and take
Right.
out some of the old soil. And
Right. Right.
Put it through vigorous tests.
Yeah. So but no, frankly, I think that they probably do turn a blind eye to the Amish. If they were strictly enforcing building codes and laws against the Amish in the same way that they enforce them against you and me, Toby, then I feel like these stories would be a lot more common. It wouldn't just be about the reflective triangles.
Which
it would
makes
be about
me
broad
begs
range
the
things.
question,
And it points out where we're at.
Why can't the police just drive on by? Like when they see these buggies, why can't they just, oh, there's something more important to do? Or why can't the judge here be like, oh, I actually became a judge so I could do real things. Maybe they didn't. Why can't I just begs the question, why not move along? But instead, every few years, they round them up and throw them in jail.
Well,
for
I
10
think it's
days.
because a lot of these traffic laws, while they're supposedly in place to protect public safety, the real purpose of a lot of these, whether you're talking about speeding violations or in many cases you're just talking about speed traps where they suddenly lower the speed limit to make you speed. What you're talking about here is it's a big source of revenue generation, not just in Kentucky, but in all states.
But these Amish aren't going to pay.
Right, I know.
It's going to cost the county
I know
tons
the
of
Amish
money.
aren't going to pay.
They just have to provide them room and board and jail for 10
But there are
days.
these hardliners at the district courts, and we've reported on some stories from here in New Hampshire too, where they need to lay down the law, because if they start to let tickets slide because of extenuating circumstances here and there, all of a sudden,
Anarchy.
all of a sudden, all of this ticket revenue is just going to crumble.
Oh, no.
To be honest, they're spending a heck of a lot more money trying to
They'll have to.
prosecute the Amish than they're making off of these fines, because they're not going to pay. You're going to have to pay to
And
jail
they're making
these men.
arses of themselves on a national level.
Yeah.
Every time these stories come out, when you see the pictures, I didn't bring the picture in, but you see the pictures
Peaceful
of the
Amish
poor
men with
peaceful
beards.
Amish men in beards all in handcuffs, waiting to go into the prison for 10 days, or the jail for 10 days. It's not a sight that makes them look all that good. Except, at least maybe from someone who's law enforcement all the way, it looks a bit better. They're like, yeah, get them Amish. I don't know.
We've been letting them fly under the radar for way too long.
Dude, they've been getting away with raw milk. No electricity. Heathens. All right. I'm sure we'll talk about this again, Nick, in the next.
Unfortunately,
Couple
I wish we
months.
didn't have to.
It'll
I wish
pop
they'd
up
just
in
leave
a-
the Amish alone. I wish they'd leave everybody alone, but especially the Amish. I mean,
Especially the Amish. Exactly. What if... Anyways. Some more good news, Nick. Let's end the show on a happy news note. Doesn't happen all that often, but when we can, let's do it. Okay. So, I don't think we've talked about SOPA, the Stop Online Piracy Act, and its little friend PIPA. So, the Protect IP address, I don't know. The House bill and the Senate bill about censoring the internet, the SOPA-PIA. Those two bills. We've talked about them in detail about how they essentially were going to fundamentally change the internet, give the government huge broad brushes to team up with corporations and regulate the internet the way they see fit. For example, if people comment on a YouTube video and put in a link that has any kind of copyrighted material, or upload a video that has any kind of copyrighted material in it, they can shut them down and be sued and put them out of business. Some good news came out last week. We didn't have a show, so we didn't talk about it, but last week there was a whole blackout on a lot of web pages. The big one would be Wikipedia. Google even blacked out their Google sign in a show of solidarity, and all sorts of Congress people and senators were bombarded with phone calls and emails. Many servers actually shut down. They got so many emails. And there's been a lot of pushback against the SOPAPIA acts. But there's still a very good likelihood that it's going to go through in some way, somehow. Even if it's not this SOPAPIA, a new SOPAPIA will come down the line, and they're going to continue to push and push, because that's what they do. They would love to regulate the internet. It's the wild, wild west, the last frontier of complete anarchy and freedom out there. So they got to regulate it, right? So it's going to happen eventually, but something that makes me very happy are what these pirates or hacker space people, or just people who want some free, unfettered internet where there's freedom of speech and people can post ideas and what they want without the government and corporations cracking down on them and shutting them down and creating their own internet, what they think it should be. It looks like Hackerspace Global Grid is a team of German hackers that aims to launch a network of communication satellites that could completely circumvent government censorship of the internet by providing their own uncensored service. The idea was born at the Chaos Communications Congress in Berlin, where hacktivist Nick Farr called upon the community of hackers that was assembled to render the government's power of censorship completely obsolete by creating an uncensored internet in the frontier of space. The idea is to launch satellites, and they can be their own. They can provide their own internet service to people all over the world, not just in the U.S., but all over the world. It would end the censorship of the internet, because it would be traditionally the government's able to control the IPs, the service providers, the internet service providers. But if there was a private company with its own satellites up there, it would make it much more difficult. I guess they could try to block funding, like sending money to these places would be one hurdle that these hackers are going to have to get around. And the next is if some government agency decides to blow their satellites out of space, shoot them down, would be another hurdle they have to get to. But other than those two hurdles, which I'm sure they're going to be able to figure out, this coming from Silver Circle, they say that in no doubt if the state starts blowing the satellites out of space, and the state meaning any foreign government, they'll find a cloaking device or something. So some good news. Anyways, we're out of time this week. Until next week, it's been Toby here with you.
And Nick.
FreeMindsTV.com in the meantime.